The room smelled of winter jasmine and expensive cologne. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations above 100 laughing people who did not know they were part of a ritual, that the night was less a party than a careful examination of who belonged where. Velvet panels and oil paintings surrounded them. The city's river winked in the distance through tall windows. It was the kind of gala where coats were kept, secrets were exchanged under the sugar bowl, and every smile was practiced for an audience of advantage. He saw her before she saw him, not because he was famous for noticing, but because he was trained to spot the anomalies. Lorenzo, Enzo Vitale, had built an empire on instincts and precise calculations that belonged equally to the boardroom and to the alleys. When he moved, people took the edges off their laughter. He was the kind of man with a patience like a trap, slow, methodical, impossible to surprise without consequence. Isabella Moretti stepped down from the marble staircase with a quietness that made her visible. She wore midnight blue. The dress fell like the hush between waves. No one fussed around her, even though she was someone the town had spoken about in half-formed sentences. The baker's late-night helper, the nurse who kept vigil at the hospice, the woman with a past like paper money, folded, creased, valuable only by the hand that owned it. She moved intentionally, clutching a small clutch as if it contained a secret rather than a phone. Enzo found himself smiling, not for the cameras nor for appearances, but because she unsettled the neatness of his day. She had been a year in the city and left tracks that hinted at resilience rather than display. He had seen her a handful of times over canvases and auctions, at charity dinners where she lingered at the edges, offering tea to servers and apologies to people she had never wronged. Tonight she seemed alone, and alone was a word Enzo was allergic to when it concerned people he liked to understand. He crossed the ballroom with the minimal entourage he allowed himself, 2 men in black, a woman with a roll of invitation lists, an air like someone moving through familiar geography. He approached her as if no one else might come between them, and inclined his head in a manner older guests would call courtly. "Isabella," he said, his voice warm as an offer, "why are you here alone?" It was a practiced question, casual, a prodding finger at someone's story. People used such questions to stitch strangers into the tapestry of small talk, but sometimes a question uncorked more than one expected. She looked up at him, and for a brief second the hall narrowed until it was only the two of them. Her eyes were a deep hazel that took in details and turned them into quiet judgments. She smiled the way people smile before they decide whether to tell a truth. "I'm not alone," she said. The sentence landed like a stone in still water, deceptively calm, but sending concentric ripples out in all directions. Enzo's brow ticked. It was the kind of answer that could mean anything. Perhaps she had someone waiting outside in a car. Perhaps she meant the city itself was her companion. Or maybe, in a more dangerous register, she was signaling an intimacy he would rather own. He should have smiled, made an easy joke about companionship being overrated, and let the night move on. He did not. Possession worked in his chest like a muscle that flexed at the hint of a prize and a threat. Isabella's answer, innocent though it might have been, threaded itself into the same pattern Enzo had used for years, a puzzle to be solved, a place to plant a flag. She saw the quick calculation in his face, and, in an almost private generosity, she gave him the truth he'd not asked for. "My neighbor," she said, as if the rest were obvious. "An old man. He lost his son in the floods last year. He's alone, and his light went out. I fix it for him. I bring him soup." Enzo blinked. The moment was small, domestic. He wanted to laugh at his own leap to possessiveness, but the thing inside him was not inclined to be embarrassed. It wanted certainty. He pursued it anyway, because certainty had been his best currency. "Your neighbor?" he asked, and when her answer confirmed his thought, the armory of his jealousy sharpened, not the childish green of childish lovers, but a more dangerous alloy, the conviction that if a woman sheltered someone else's loyalty, she might one day shelter someone else's heart. She shrugged gently and folded the fabric of her sleeve like someone straightening papers. "I'm never truly alone," she said. "Sometimes the world is loud, but you can still be not alone in the quiet." The answer should have settled him. Instead, it set him hunting. Enzo's affections had always been exacting. He loved like a man who arranged his books alphabetically. There was a right place and a wrong place, and anything out of concordance invited a correction. Isabella's answer lodged itself as a small irritation that demanded action. He was not a man who suffered ambiguity well. Ambiguity was an invitation to rules that split 10 ways. Over the following days, what began in the ballroom as a small restlessness became a project of attention. Enzo arranged for Isabella to be invited to events, dinners where he was,
concerts he patronized, a gallery opening with wine that tasted like age. He watched how she moved through the city, how she answered questions about work, how she paused in bookstores. He noted friends and small habits, like a man mapping a room by touch in the dark. Isabella noticed the patronage the way a thrush notices the first thaw. She accepted with the courtesy of someone who had learned to survive by being polite. She kept her distance in small, tidy ways, never appearing as property, never giving the man reasons to believe she belonged to him. But she was not immune to the threat that came with attention. Eyes that lingered too long had a tone that made the heart tighten. Soon enough, subtle things began to happen. A florist with a discreet hand left roses at her bakery unannounced. A taxi driver whose face she recognized from the market always turned up with the meters paused. Small exemplars of envy and power, placed as if by a hand not hers. Isabella's life, which had been her own work of careful steps, began to smell faintly of other people's plans. It might have remained contained, the slight discomfort of public attention, if not for envy's habit of finding the weakest seam. Enzo found his weakness in a rumor, a whisper that a man named Matteo Rossi had been seen in town with Isabella late at night, stepping into a shadowed cafe. Matteo, according to tongues that thought themselves discreet, had a history with Enzo's rivals, associations and debts that could not be put into polite conversation. The rumor pleased Enzo's most dangerous part, the story that could justify action. Enzo didn't confront Matteo at once. He watched. Sometimes jealousy wears the mask of caution until that mask is absent and the action beneath it is cruelly inevitable. When a valet brought a photograph from the corner of a street camera caught by chance, 2 silhouettes leaving a closed cafe, Enzo felt a slow certainty. The grainy image might have been anything, it might have been nothing. He used it to make an argument in his head until the argument sounded like his destiny. He ordered his men to follow Matteo. He told himself he would confirm what he suspected and then close the matter like one sweeps dust from a table. His men were efficient. They reported small things back like rhythms. Matteo meeting men at a warehouse. Matteo speaking in whispers at the docks. The reports fed a story Enzo already wanted to believe.
The man he had grown to like, the woman who had fixed a light for an old neighbor, was now being rewritten into a plot point he was determined to edit. The first act of violence was swift and measured. Matteo Rossi, taken in a moment of careless bravado, was taught a lesson that left him freckled with bruises and with a caution that would carry for years. It was a message, intimate and effective: do not trespass. Enzo told himself he had enforced boundaries. No one ever asked whether Matteo had loved Isabella or simply used her presence as convenience. What mattered was that a line had been drawn. The town learned quietly. Gossip diffused into tea rooms and waited on the steps of the market. People who had seen Isabella and Matteo together began to look for fault lines where none were certain. Isabella, returning to her small apartment after tending to the old man's nightlight, felt a new pressure. The world, she realized, had conspired to rewrite her intimacies. She had not asked for this. She confronted Enzo one evening when the air was cold and the city's noises had thinned to distant traffic. He had come to her bakery not as a lord in a suit, but as a man who pretended his hands were merely there for comfort. He had sat at a small table and watched the way she arranged pastries with the tenderness of a priest. "Did you send them?" she asked without preamble. He watched the steam curl up from his espresso. There was a gentleness in the way he placed his palms together, but also a hardness in the eyes that were used to the language of command. "He made sure he were safe," he said. "Did Matteo deserve it? None of them do." He leaned forward. "Would he rather he remained a threat? Would he have preferred I did nothing?" She thought of the old man's face, the way his hands had closed around a bowl of soup she had warmed on Sunday afternoons. She thought of nights alone in her small room and of the decision she had made years before to live simply and offer what she could. "You don't get to decide who I keep in my life as if they were objects. You can't clean the world by hurting people you don't trust." The conversation could have been the one that repaired things. It could have been the moment a man with power learned restraint. But restraint had never been Enzo's first language. The kernel of his jealousy, once planted, grew fast. It became not merely about Matteo and lurid rumors, but about trust and control. If a woman could harbor someone in her life who might one day take her away, then that woman had to be affixed and tamed. He began to see the world in terms that favored possession over affection. From small punishments, he stepped to larger calculations. Men who were friendly to Isabella received messages: a late payment for work, a damaged car, an embarrassment staged just so. People who admired a woman in Enzo's domain found their job prospects dimmer. It was subtle, but effective. Isabella watched friends keep distance. She watched suppliers offer excuses. The village's network of favors, once a source of warmth, turned into a string of compromises.
She attempted to walk away. That was the last thing Enzo had expected. He had neither desired nor feared a woman who would simply leave. Possession had been his way of feeling alive. Release would be a theft he could not stomach. When she told him, as their relationship went from ritual to something more intimate and then colder, that she would not be controlled, Enzo's reaction was a maneuver of violence that advanced like a chess piece. He arranged a show of force that was meant to be surgical and final. A night at a private house on the edge of town, a dinner that he insisted they attend together, was the stage. Isabella arrived in a gown as pale as river mist, and for the first hour the world seemed to hold its breath. Enzo was charming, the perfect host, the man whose smile could be read in currencies. After dessert, as the clock hands flirted with midnight, the atmosphere changed.
Enzo called for a private walk in the garden. Under a moon heavy with intentional light, he could not help the animal that stirred inside him. "You promised me a truth," he said softly. "Not to be mine, I never want that, but to be honest. Why are you tangled with others?" She looked at him, at the man whose hands had once steadied her when she helped the old man cross the street. "Because I know how to be human," she said. "Because I remember that people are messy and generous and sometimes broken in ways you can't fix." He guided his hand to her wrist and held her there like a compass. She felt the intention as if it were a physical pressure. "You could be safe with me," he whispered. "And be controlled," she replied. The word seemed to be a stone thrown into a still pool. He let go of her wrist, and the movement cracked something between them. In the week that followed, Enzo grew colder. His rage, now personalized, found someone to blame, and she was not the only target. He expanded his reach and pulled at strings that had once been serviceable. Jobs disappeared, business deals for friends stalled, a supplier suddenly made a mistake that cost a man dinner money. The network folded tighter like a containment. Then the worst happened. In a mistake that would become a wound for everyone, the wrong man was targeted for a violent lesson that was supposed to frighten Isabella into submission. Enzo had ordered a message, something brutal yet precise, a reminder that his domain was not a suggestion. The men who carried out the order had been told a name and a face in a hurry. They'd been given a grainy image of the supposed friend and sent to make noise. Instead of the friend, they found a stranger leaving a late shift at the docks, a man who bartended at a club, who had smiled at Isabella once, who had once handed her a warm sandwich when she had been hungry and alone years ago. He was not complicit in anything. He was worse. He was simply living his life at the wrong time in the wrong place. They beat him in the alley until he could barely stand and left him for a passerby to find. The town woke up to sirens and a man in the hospital with a concussion and months of recovery ahead. The brutality stung the air with a moral tang that tasted like iron. The man's name was Simon. His mother placed calls to anyone who might help. For a time, jokes about the Empire's reach curdled into a silence heavier than morning fog. Isabella found him in the hospital by chance or by something like fate. A nurse recognized her as the woman who'd once made soup for the neighbor and guided her down the hall to a bed whose occupant had seen better nights. She placed a hand on his brow and felt for the first time an urgency that was not for her own removal. When Enzo learned what had happened, the truth broke him in a way he had not been fitted for. He had ordered a measure intended to be surgical and to frighten a woman into loyalty. Instead, he had maimed an innocent. Rage recoiled in him and turned inward. It was one thing to order harm to men who had been problems. It was another to have the city's blood on your hands for no reason but your own jealousy. Isabella, furious and exhausted and full of a sorrow that grew heavy in her chest, left him. She walked out of his life with a grace that surprised the onlookers, a woman who refused to be a prize taken from a shelf. She cut ties not in grand proclamations, but in small, relentless acts. She refused his calls. She changed her scarf. She continued her nightly soup runs, but now she did them alone and with steadier hands. Her withdrawal was a quiet vengeance, and Enzo felt every hour of it like a winter's bite. The city, which had once admired him for his arrangements and his patronage, watched the man unravel through the prism of a new scandal. People who had been silent now had sentences. Some offered apologies like lit candles. Others wanted to see the man fall entirely. The press, deft at finding the script that suits a nation's appetite, wrote pieces about power and responsibility. Enzo's allies measured whether it was time to distance themselves.
He tried to fix what he had done. In private, not with announcements but with checks and rough hands, he paid for the best surgeons, insisted the hospital take no fee, and offered whatever help he could. He visited the battered man with an awkward humility that surprised his aides. He gave money to charities that taught men to manage anger, and to town councils that fixed the streetlights under which the attack had occurred. The gestures were not justice, they were repair, small and insufficient. But nothing could erase the moral calculus that had been altered. Isabella could not forgive a system that allowed such violent temper to be a method of persuasion. She no longer wanted
The nuance of Enzo's regret. She wanted to be free of the cloud he cast. In the end, she understood that leaving him was not triumph, it was survival. His empire shuddered in small ways that mattered. Contracts lost, men who once benefited from proximity moved on, friends who had remained loyal shifted like weather vanes. Enzo learned the loneliness of a man who had believed himself above consequence. He no longer had the city path clear for the taking. He had to carve a way through a landscape that did not bend to his will. Months passed like the slow unwinding of a spool. The man who had loved Isabella in the fashion of territory and not tenderness found himself conversing with an effigy of the person he had been. He took long rides at night, and sometimes he visited the hospice where Isabella had once worked, seeing her name in the staff book and then moving on, as if the sight were a thorn too fresh to touch. Isabella rebuilt the parts of life she had been given. She taught a boy in the bakery how to knead dough. She sat with a man whose wife had died and learned how to listen without fixing. She never became famous for any grand act of moral clarity. She simply lived. In the privacy of her apartment, she wrote letters to the old neighbor, now sleeping less, and smiled at the way life could be sustained by small things: a repaired lamp, a warm bowl of soup, a morning's forgiveness. As for Enzo, he could not become someone else overnight. He did change with the discipline of consequence. He closed a chapter of his life that had been built around a single closed ideal, that love could be owned. The man who had once thought jealousy a right learned the cost of making that lesson literal. Years later, at a memorial for a woman who ran a shelter for battered men and women, Isabella stood in the back among a small crowd and watched as Enzo moved through the room like someone testing a new skin. He had achieved things he would not boast of: fundraising for the shelter, public apologies that read as apologies rather than corporate statements, and small acts of reparation that meant less than he wished, but more than nothing. He had made the shelter a beneficiary in his will, and he had hired trainers for men who needed help to moderate temper. He had done the work grudgingly at first, and then with the slow humility of someone who had tasted what it was to be wrong. They did not speak that night. There was no reconciliation in the tidy sense of movies and novellas. But in the way of people who have been close to a wound and walked around it, they met in the same place for different reasons. She to honor the shelter's founder, he to atone. He watched her place flowers by a small plaque and felt the old muscle of possession twitch and then die down. Perhaps the part of him that had loved her still burned, but what had replaced raw ownership was a quieter something, understanding that respect was not a transaction, and that love, if it was to exist at all, needed freedom as much as devotion. On his way out, he left a card by the organizer's table with a brief line: "For the work you do, it matters more than I can ever say." It was the nearest thing to a confession he could write without vanity. Outside, the winter air cut like a clean blade. Isabella walked along the river for a long time, the city's lights wavering in the water like 100 promises. She touched the locket at her throat. Inside, a small, faded photograph of the neighbor's boy, a reminder of the life she had chosen. She had no illusions about Enzo. He would never become someone else entirely, but perhaps he could stop being the man who broke people when he felt slighted. The story that began with a single question, "Why are you here alone?" did not end with a neat judgment. Jealousy had done what jealousy does best. It burned, it scarred, it exposed the fragile seams between love and ownership. But in the ashes were seeds. People who had been hurt learned how to guard their hearts. People who misused power learned the hard work of repair. The city, which had always loved a neat narrative, learned instead a more troublesome truth, that redemption is slow work and that the cost of violence is never repayable in kind. Isabella walked on until she could not see the lights any longer, and then she turned homeward to make soup for an old man who still slept with his window open, as if expecting someone who might not come. In that ordinary, stubborn act, a plate set on a table, a chair pulled back, a hand held for a moment, she found the answer to the question that had sparked the whole catastrophe. "No," she said to the river, to the winter, to the empty air that once felt like ownership. "I am not alone. I am surrounded by people who make me brave." And somewhere, in a car that moved through the night with a driver who knew not to ask, Enzo Vitale understood at last how small actions might be the truest kind of power. He'd learned the lesson by losing it, a mercy that came too late, but real all the same.